Boa noite a todas e todos. É uma grande alegria para mim estar outra vez no Brasil, especialmente em Curitiba, modelo mundial de uma cidade inovadora. Sinto-me honrado por poder estar no mesmo espaço que o Jaime Lerner, o arquiteto deste modelo de uma cidade sustentável. Infelizmente, meu português ainda é muito limitado, então vou prosseguir em inglês. I have greatly enjoyed this conference. I have listened to many very interesting lectures and panels. As we have heard repeatedly in the last 2 or 3 days, one of the great challenges of our time is to build and nurture sustainable communities. And since the majority of people today around the world live in towns or cities, building sustainable cities is a key challenge for urban design. In his opening lecture, Jaime Lerner urged us to begin with a clear understanding of sustainability. And I would like to take Jaime's advice and begin my talk by reflecting about what sustainability really means. What is sustained in a sustainable community is not economic growth, the growth of a city, or competitive advantage. What is sustained is the entire web of life on which our long-term survival depends. In other words, a sustainable city must be designed in such a way that its ways of life, its businesses, its economy, physical structures and technologies do not interfere with nature's inherent ability to sustain life. Now, the first step in this endeavor naturally needs to be to understand how nature sustains life. It turns out that this involves a new ecological understanding of life, as well as a new kind of thinking, which is called systemic thinking, and is thinking in terms of relationships, in terms of patterns and context. And indeed, such a new understanding of life has emerged over the last 30 years or so. And this is what I have written about in my books. At the forefront of contemporary science, the universe is no longer seen as a machine composed of elementary building blocks. We have discovered that the material world ultimately is a network of inseparable patterns of relationships. That the planet as a whole is a living, self-regulating system. The view of the human body as a machine and of the mind as a separate entity is being replaced by one that sees not only the brain, but also the immune system, the bodily tissues, and in fact, every single cell as a living cognitive system. Evolution is no longer seen as a competitive struggle for existence, but rather as a cooperative dance in which creativity and the constant emergence of novelty are the driving forces. And with the emphasis on complexity, networks, and patterns of organization, a new science of qualities is now slowly emerging. So this is a very, very brief summary of the main themes of this new understanding of life. And this new conception of life, which is now being developed at the forefront of science, can be seen as part of a broader change of paradigms from a mechanistic to a holistic and ecological view of the world. At the very core of this cultural transformation, we find a shift of metaphors from seeing the world as a machine, as you saw in this short movie clip, to understanding it as a network. One of the most important insights of the new understanding of life is the recognition that networks are the basic pattern of life. Now, you all know about social networks. You know about the internet, about the various Facebook, Twitter, and these various social networks. Today, this is a key characteristic of our world, social networks. But several decades before they were developed, scientists discovered that networks are also basic for all living systems. Biological life has organized itself in terms of networks. So we have ecosystems that are understood as food webs, that is, networks of organisms. Organisms are networks of cells, and cells are networks of molecules. So the network is a pattern that is common to all life. Wherever we see life, we see networks. Now, it is important to realize that these networks are not physical structures. You cannot go out into nature and take a picture of the web of life, because the web of life is a conceptual network. It is what we call a functional network, a pattern of relationships between various life processes. In a cell, for example, these processes are chemical reactions between the cell's molecules. In a food web, the processes are processes of feeding, of organisms eating one another. In both cases, the network is a non-material pattern of relationships. And these living networks have been studied very closely in the last 30 years or so, and it has been discovered that their key characteristic is that they are self-generating. For example, in a cell, all the biological structures, the proteins, the enzymes, the DNA, the membranes, and so on, all these structures are continually produced, repaired, and regenerated by the cellular network. Similarly, at the level of multicellular organisms, the bodily cells are continually regenerated and recycled by the body's metabolic network. So living networks continually create or recreate themselves by transforming or replacing their components. This can also be observed in the social realm, in social networks. Here, of course, we're not dealing with chemical reactions, we're dealing with communications. Social networks are networks of communications. And like biological networks, they continually generate themselves. Each conversation creates information, thoughts, meaning, and these then give rise to further conversations. And so the entire network generates itself. Now, when we talk about social networks, the question of meaning is crucial. Even when social networks generate material structures, such as the goods that we produce in our businesses, artifacts, works of art, infrastructure, All this is produced by social networks, but even then, these structures are very different from the structures produced by biological networks. They are usually produced for a purpose, according to some design, and they embody some meaning. Now, as communications continue in a social network, they go round and crisscross along through the network, and they form multiple feedback loops where information comes back and is then moderated and sent out again, and eventually this produces a shared system of beliefs, explanations, and values. A common context of meaning, which is known as culture. This is what culture is. And this culture is continually sustained by further communications. Through culture, we acquire identities as members of a community. And community is just another expression for a social network. So, through this identity as belonging to a community, the network generates a boundary, because when we belong to a community, we show our identity by acting in a certain way. People who are part of a business community dress in a certain way, they speak in a certain way. People who are part of a football club dress differently and speak differently, and so every community has a different identity. So to me this is very interesting, because it shows that the network of communications creates a culture which then restricts the behavior of the members of this network. In addition to these rules of behavior, a social network also produces a shared body of knowledge, including information, ideas, skills, and this body of knowledge also shapes the distinctive way of life of that culture. And the values and beliefs of the culture affect the body of knowledge, because they are the lens through which we see the world. Well, networks, as I said, are of crucial importance today, and they are quite different from the structures that scientists have studied in the past. Networks are non-linear, and they are patterns of relationships. So understanding networks requires a different way of thinking. Thinking in terms of relationships, in terms of patterns, in terms of context. And as I mentioned before, this is known as systemic thinking in science. This is also crucial for ecology, because ecology, you may know the word ecology is derived from the Greek oikos, which means household. And ecology is the science of the relationships between the various members of the Earth household. So this new thinking, this systemic thinking, emerged in the 1920s and 1930s from a series of interdisciplinary dialogues in Europe, dialogues among biologists, psychologists, and ecologists. And in all these fields, scientists realized that a living system, an organism, an ecosystem, or a social system, is an integrated whole whose properties cannot be reduced to those of smaller parts. The so-called systemic properties are properties of the whole which none of the parts have. So systemic thinking involves a shift of perspective from the parts to the whole and from objects to relationships. The early systemic thinkers expressed this in the famous phrase, "The whole is more than the sum of its parts." Now, what exactly does this mean? In what sense exactly is the whole more than the sum of its parts? Well, the answer is relationships. All the essential properties of a living system depend on the relationships among the system's components. So systemic thinking means thinking in terms of relationships. These relationships include the relationships among the system's components and also relationships between the system as a whole and the environment, other systems in the environment. These other kind of relationships between the system and the environment is what we mean by context. So systemic thinking is always contextual thinking. Now, all this is not very easy for us, and especially not easy for those of us who have a science education. Because in science, we have always been taught that things need to be measured and weighed. They need to be quantified in order to be scientific. But relationships cannot be quantified. So there is another shift of thinking, of perspective, from measuring to mapping, and from quantity to quality. And when you map relationships, you will find certain configurations that occur repeatedly, such as networks, cycles, and so on. This is what we call a pattern. Now, when we look at living systems and study its patterns, we also find that an outstanding characteristic of these patterns is that they are non-linear, like the network that goes in all directions, or like a cycle, which is not a straight line. And so systemic thinking also involves a shift from linear to non-linear thinking. So now we can try to apply this new conception of life to studying the structures, metabolic processes, and evolution of the myriads of species on the planet. And when we do that, we notice immediately that the outstanding characteristic of the biosphere is that it has sustained life for billions of years. How does the Earth do that? Well, to understand how nature sustains life, we need to move from biology to ecology, because sustained life is a property of an ecosystem, not of a single organism or species. Over billions of years of evolution, the Earth's ecosystems have evolved certain principles of organization to sustain the web of life. Knowledge of these principles of organization, or principles of ecology, is what I call ecological literacy. It is crucial for designing sustainable human communities. In fact, in the coming decades, the survival of humanity will depend on our ecological literacy, on our ability to understand the basic principles of ecology and to live accordingly. This means that ecological literacy must become a critical skill for politicians, business leaders, and professionals in all spheres. And that it should be the most important part of education at all levels, from primary and secondary schools to colleges, universities, and the continuing education and training of professionals. We need to teach our children, our students, and our business and political leaders, if you wish, the basic facts of life. For example, the fact that the waste of one species in an ecosystem is food for another species, so that matter cycles continually through the web of life. The fact that the energy driving these ecological cycles flows from the sun. That diversity assures resilience. And that life, from its very beginning, more than 3 billion years ago, did not take over the planet by combat, but by networking. Well, all these are fundamental principles of ecology, and in fact, they are closely interrelated. They are just different aspects of a single pattern of organization that has enabled nature to sustain life for billions of years. In a nutshell, nature sustains life by creating and nurturing communities. We know that no individual organism can exist in isolation. Animals depend on the photosynthesis of plants for their energy needs. Plants depend on the carbon dioxide produced by animals, as well as on the nitrogen fixed by bacteria and other microorganisms at their roots. And together, plants, animals, and microorganisms regulate the entire biosphere and maintain the conditions conducive to life. So you see, sustainability is not an individual property, but a property of an entire web of relationships. It always involves a whole community. This is the profound lesson we need to learn from nature. The way to sustain life is to build and nurture community. Well, all this has direct relevance to urban design, because most of our modern cities not only destroy natural habitats that used to be an integral part of our daily lives, but also divide us from each other in our communities. Those of you who heard Jaime speak at the beginning of the conference will remember this picture of a turtle he showed, which is his metaphor for the life of a city. And he says, just as you can't cut up a turtle, you cannot cut up a city. You must not separate the population according to age or profession or religion or social class. Well, a very similar thought is expressed by a colleague of mine in Berkeley at the University of California, who is an urban designer, and his name is Randolph Hester. And he believes that sustainable cities can only be created by combining ecological knowledge with direct participatory democracy. And I think this is especially relevant for Brazil, because you have great experience in participatory democracy. And so if you can combine this with ecological knowledge, then you can find solutions to the urban problems. And Hester calls this combination ecological democracy. And he has written a book called Design for Ecological Democracy, which I recommend very much. And when you read this book, you will find that his thought is very close to the thought of Jaime Lerner here in Curitiba. Hester maintains that designers can play a critical role by creating urban forms that enable citizens to engage in deliberation and cooperation with their local communities. Architectural forms that enhance the life of community in cities. Well, let me return now to ecological literacy. Once we become ecologically literate, once we understand the processes and patterns of relationships that enable ecosystems to sustain life, we will also understand the many ways in which our human civilization, especially since the Industrial Revolution, has ignored these ecological patterns and processes and has interfered with them. And we will realize that these interferences are the fundamental causes of many of our current world problems. It is now becoming more and more evident that the major problems of our time cannot be understood in isolation. They are systemic problems, which means that they are all interconnected and interdependent. One of the most detailed and masterful documentations of the fundamental interconnectedness of world problems is the recent book by Lester Brown, who is also very well known in Brazil. The book is called Plan B and is available in a Portuguese edition here. Brown, as you may know, is the founder of the World Watch Institute and one of the most authoritative environmental thinkers today. He demonstrates in this book with impeccable clarity how the vicious circle of demographic pressure, pressure of population growth, and poverty leads to the depletion of resources, to falling water tables, wells going dry, shrinking forests, collapsing fisheries, eroding soils, grasslands turning into desert, and so on. And how this resource depletion, exacerbated by climate change, produces so-called failing states. States whose governments can no longer provide security for their citizens, some of whom in sheer desperation turn to terrorism. This first part of Brown's book is predictably depressing. But the second part is optimistic and exciting. With business as usual, Brown asserts, the environmental trends that are undermining our future will continue. So we need an alternative strategy, and Plan B, he calls it, is such an alternative strategy. He calls it a roadmap to save civilization. I recommend this book very highly to you. So I'm tonight recommending two books to you. The first one is for architects and urban designers. It is in part quite technical, but you will find it very useful. It's called Design for Ecological Democracy. And the second book I recommend to everybody, and that is Lester Brown's Plan B. Now, the theoretical framework underlying Plan B is based on the thorough understanding of the basic principles of ecology. All its proposals are based on existing technologies and illustrated with successful examples from countries around the world. They involve applying basic ecological knowledge to the redesign of our technologies and social institutions so as to bridge the current gap that we have between human design and the sustainable systems of nature. This is what is known as ecological design or eco-design. From the ecological perspective, design can be understood as the shaping of flows of energy and matter for human purposes. Design is the shaping of flows of energy and matter for human purposes. Ecological design is a process in which our human purposes are carefully meshed with the larger patterns and flows of the natural world. Ecological design principles reflect the principles of organization that nature has evolved to sustain the web of life. Now, to practice design in such a context requires a fundamental shift in our attitude toward nature. A shift from finding out what we can extract from nature to finding out what we can learn from her. As you know, there has been a dramatic rise in ecologically oriented design practices and projects in recent years, all of which are now well documented, many of which are being discussed at this conference, and many of which have been developed right here in Brazil. I'll give you a few examples. There is now a worldwide renaissance in organic farming, where farmers use technologies based on ecological knowledge rather than chemistry or genetic engineering, and in doing so, they increase their yields, they can control pests, and they build soil fertility. We can also see the organization of different industries into ecological clusters in which the waste of any one organization is a resource for another. This was promoted by an organization called ZERI, founded by Gunther Pauli, who also often comes to Brazil and works here. Other eco-designers advocate a shift from a product-oriented economy to what they call a service and flow economy, in which industrial raw materials and technical components cycle continually between manufacturers and users. We have green architecture, which is a thriving field and of which Jaime Lerner is one of the great pioneers. We now have buildings that are designed to produce more energy than they use, that emit no waste, buildings that monitor their own performance. And of course, Curitiba has been at the forefront of applying ecological principles to urban design. Now, all these eco-design technologies and projects incorporate the basic principles of ecology and therefore have some key characteristics in common. They tend to be small-scale projects with plenty of diversity, energy efficient, non-polluting, community-oriented, and labor-intensive, thus creating plenty of jobs. The current eco-design revolution makes it evident that we have the knowledge and the technologies to build a sustainable future. What we need is political will and leadership. And I hope that this conference will contribute to enhancing this leadership around the world. And with that, I thank you for your attention. Muito obrigado.
What new areas in physics do you see as having most spiritual or cult aspects?
Well, I have not studied the parallels between the latest discoveries in physics and spiritual traditions. This is work I did in the Tao of physics that is now 35 years ago. However, I can tell you that whatever I said in that book is still valid, and in fact, the latest edition of the book has an afterword with an update on what happened in physics, but in terms of the relationship to philosophies of spiritual traditions, I don't think there's anything new.
What branch or sub-branch of science are you most excited by at the moment? Ok, qual a pergunta está em inglês, então qual braço ou subbraço da ciência com o qual você se encontra mais excitado ao momento, neste momento?
Well, this is a very good question, because I came across a very exciting discovery which is not yet generally known, which is really at the forefront of science, and it is a discovery in microbiology. About 2 or 3 months ago, I was sitting in my office in Berkeley, and I got a phone call out of the blue from a young scientist who said, "My name is Yuri," his father is Russian and called him Yuri. He said, "My name is Yuri, and my father gave me the Tao of Physics to read when I was a child. And I am now a microbiologist, and I want to tell you about my research." And it was very, very fascinating what he discovered. And I will try to describe it to you in 5 minutes. It gets a little bit technical, but I will try. You know probably that all cells need oxygen to breathe. There's a cellular respiration that uses oxygen. This is true for the cells in our body. The oxygen comes to the cells through the blood. And it is also true for single cells, which are bacteria or other microorganisms. Now, this guy Yuri studies bacteria. And it is known that not all bacteria use oxygen. Some can also use iron or other metals. The oxygen-breathing bacteria are called aerobic, and the other ones are called anaerobic. Now, when you study the detailed process of cellular respiration, and it's a complex chemical process, those of you who have done this in college will remember it's a very complex process. And what it does is it takes the food that comes into the cell, the sugar and so on, and transforms it into special molecules that are the energy carriers for all the cellular processes. Those molecules are called ATP molecules. Don't ask me what it stands for, I forgot, it's a long chemical word. So, the cellular respiration transforms sugar into ATP molecules. And in this process, there are many electrons that are left over, and they need to go somewhere, otherwise the process doesn't work. And the oxygen picks up the electrons. Okay? So the oxygen is what they call an electron acceptor. Now what Yuri discovered is the following. When you have a culture of bacteria, either in the laboratory or in nature, and you reduce the availability of oxygen, which is really necessary for those bacteria to live, they do something very strange. They grow tiny hairs, which are called nano wires. They're called nano wires because they're in the realm of nanotechnology, and they are wires because they conduct electrons. So these bacteria interconnect with the electron, with each other, through these wires, and form an electrical network of wires conducting electrons. This knowledge is only about 2 years old. This was not known at all before. And the papers, most of the papers have not yet been published. Now, the way Yuri explains this is, suppose we are here in this big building, and so we are 2,000 people, and somebody switches off the air conditioning and closes all the doors. And then we can stay here maybe for another half hour or so, and then we will run out of oxygen. And suppose there is one door open in the back, where the air comes in. Then what we will do is we will rush towards this door, right? And there'll be chaos. Now, if we could just touch each other and hold hands to use the oxygen collectively, that's what the bacteria do. So it's a collective breathing, and I have seen photographs of this network of bacteria. It looks exactly like brain cells, like photographs of neural networks. So this is a new kind of network of a collective breathing of bacteria, which was just discovered very recently, and it has tremendous implications for all of science. So this is what I'm most excited about right now.
Bem, nós vamos fazer 3 perguntas de cada vez. Uma primeira pergunta é pergunta quanto à possibilidade de você fazer uma reedição do ponto de notação nos capítulos, principalmente nos capítulos que tratam do capitalismo e do socialismo, ambos como, naquela ocasião, vistos como fazendo parte, né, da lógica antiecológica cartesiana. Mas, diante dessa experiência mais recente, diante dos novos fatos vivenciados, como é que você vê a questão, as novas críticas sistêmicas que os socialistas estão fazendo na relação capitalismo e meio ambiente? Essa é uma pergunta. A outra pergunta tem a ver que otimismo você se encontra em relação à seriedade dos nossos políticos e dos nossos líderes. Uma terceira pergunta qual é a sua visão cronológica para uma efetiva mudança da matriz energética nos sistemas de transportes a nível mundial? Transportes mundial, acho que aqui, porque tem a questão dos navios, dos aviões, eu acho que é mais específica realmente a questão das matriz energética dos sistemas dos transportes a nível mundial. Aí nós faremos 3 perguntas de cada vez, porque são muitas as perguntas, e vamos ver até onde nós conseguimos ir.
Okay, well, these questions will take us up to midnight, right? And the others will be after midnight. But these are all important questions. Well, I'm very happy to tell you, regarding the first question, there is already a re-edition of The Turning Point. It's not exactly a re-edition, but my book, The Hidden Connection, Portuguese As Conexões Ocultas, is the 21st century version of The Turning Point. And in fact, I realized this only after I finished writing the book, but it really addresses the same issues The systems view of life is much more developed now, and so that is in the new book. And you mentioned the capitalism of the time and the communism. This is updated to the new form of capitalism, which we have now, which is also called the global economy or the new economy. It's a capitalism of financial networks. So all this you will find in this book, The Hidden Connections. The second question, what optimism do I have about politics? Well, I can tell you that the greatest optimism is about a cooperation between the three centers of power that exist in today's world. The first two are traditional centers of power, government and business. But now there is a new center, and that is the global civil society. And the global civil society began in an international coalition of NGOs in Seattle in the year 1999, with the big protests against the meeting of the World Trade Organization. And this coalition was then nourished and further developed here in Brazil, in Porto Alegre, in the meetings of the World Social Forum. And I believe that we can solve the world's problems only if government, business and civil society work together. And I am very happy to say that the only big country in the world where this happens is Brazil. Brazil is a model, and I know you will say, well, it's not so great, there are many difficulties, politicians are corrupt, and so on. And that is true. But the collaboration between government and civil society is much further here than in other countries. Just as an anecdote, I came to Brazil the first time in 1992, and in the following years I got to know many environmental organizations, many NGOs, and I did workshops and seminars with them, and they told me about their projects, and I got to know them very well. Well, after, when Lula was elected president in 2003, I came back, and soon after that, I met several of my old friends who were now working in the ministries of the government. They were working in the Ministry of the Environment with Marina Silva, and they were working in the Ministry of Education and in other ministries. So they were able to really bring these ideas that had been developed in civil society into the government. And even if it's not perfect today, I would encourage you to continue this as much as you can and forge relationships and networks between government, business and civil society. And when I go around and give talks like this in other parts of the world, I always mention Brazil as a model for the world, because this is really something, and in fact, I don't know whether I'm right, but my conviction is that the great success of Brazil of the last 10 years as an economic power and a world leader is due largely to this cooperation between government, civil society and business. So I'm very optimistic about that. Well, the third question is really a difficult one, the world transportation, and I can only refer to references. In this book of mine, The Hidden Connections, in the last chapter, I talk about ecological design, and I give many references of books where this is documented. And in these references, you also find plans and scenarios of transportation. A critical element is that we need a liquid fuel for transportation, for our trains and buses and cars and ships and airplanes. We need a liquid fuel. We know that we cannot use petroleum because it is not sustainable. because of global climate change. But hydrogen is an ideal fuel. Hydrogen is the most abundant element in the world. And the only reason why we don't have hydrogen as a fuel is that we don't have the infrastructure. You need production of hydrogen, you need fuel cells, you need a whole different infrastructure. But there are plans, and again in these references you will find scenarios of how to build this infrastructure. And actually, Jeremy Rifkin the other night, last night, said that the European Union is now committed to using hydrogen as a storage of energy and also as a fuel for transportation.
Como não impor a visão ecológica da compreensão do mundo e da vida, considerando a multi- e transdisciplinaridade de como princípios de construção do conhecimento. Ou seja, como alcançar essa compreensão ecológica do mundo e da vida sem considerar, né, a multi- e a transdisciplinaridade enquanto princípios de construção do conhecimento.
We can convey, I prefer convey rather than impose, convey the ecological vision only in a transdisciplinary manner. Ecology is inherently transdisciplinary because ecology involves the relationships of species with each other and with their environment. And so you need to know biology, you need to know evolution, you need to know soil chemistry, atmospheric chemistry, thermodynamics, and on and on. And this is ecology without humans. Now, when you have ecology in human ecosystems, human ecology, then you have to add technology, political science, psychology, anthropology, and all that.
Sex.
So is always...
Sex also?
Huh?
Sex.
Also, yes. Well, actually, sex begins with bacteria in evolution. You know? That's when sex began. Now, it is very important to organize interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary courses at our university. And I know this is very difficult because the universities are organized in a fragmented way. My own contribution to this is a big writing project in which I'm involved right now. I'm in the process of writing a textbook for universities where the material that I discussed in my last books will be presented in a format appropriate for university students. And it is called The Systems View of Life, and it will be published by Cambridge University Press, which is a very, very good publisher, and it will be an interdisciplinary course, and it will be finished at the end of next year and then published in 2 years.
Os sistemas florestais, agroflorestais, podem ser considerados como uma alternativa. A literatura ecológica, como pode ser incentivada a literatura ecológica? Você acredita que a literatura, a Ecological Literacy, a literatura ecológica pode ajudar a melhorar a moralidade de uma comunidade? Em outras palavras, ela pode ajudar o povo a agir melhor em relação com os outros?
Yes, thank you again. These are excellent questions. The first one about agroforestry. This is an important part of what is generally known as agroecology, or also sustainable agriculture. And this is one of the things that I mentioned in my lecture that was developed right here in Brazil. There are many organic farms, especially in the south of Brazil, in Rio Grande do Sul. And there are also many projects of agroforestry, which means a combination of forestry and agriculture, in other states of Brazil. So this is something very important. A friend of mine who is a professor at Berkeley is very much involved in that. I don't know whether you have come across his name. He's from Chile, and his name is Miguel Altieri. And Miguel Altieri is one of the founders of this whole movement of agroecology, and he works a lot in Brazil, and he has also founded an academic institution called SOCLA, S-O-C-L-A, SOCLA. And I don't remember what it stands for, but the L and A stands for Latino America, and the O stands for, I don't know, organic maybe, but what it is a scientific society for agroecology in Latin America. And if you look up SOCLA on the internet, you will find their website. They have conferences, they have scientific journals, and they also have a campus in Venezuela. And it unifies all of Latin America in the attempt to do agroecology. So this is a very promising field. The third question was, can ecoliteracy help improve social relationships and communities? And I can answer with a very firm yes to that. I know this from experience because I have worked now for almost 20 years with an organization I co-founded, which is called the Center for Ecoliteracy in Berkeley. And what we do is we train teachers to teach ecology, and we do this by taking the children out into nature, into a school garden or into a riverbed, to experience, to do ecological projects and to experience ecology firsthand in a practical way. And we have developed a whole pedagogy. This is all published on our website, which is ecoliteracy.org. And we have developed a whole pedagogy, and we also wanted to test the pedagogy. So we hired a scholar from an American university, from Columbia University, to devise special tests for this ecoliteracy, for these schools. And the tests showed that, not surprisingly, when you compare children in an ecoliteracy school and children in another school, then the ecoliteracy children know more about ecology. And that is not surprising because that's what we teach them. Of course they know more. But what they also found is in those ecoliteracy schools, there are fewer crimes, there is less violence, there is less truancy, children stay away from school less, there's greater attendance, and in one word, there is a greater sense of community. And this is directly a result of our pedagogy, because we teach ecology by teaching community. You remember I said sustainability is achieved by creating and nurturing communities. And so ecoliteracy and community is very closely related.
Então, uma pergunta minha. Então, quando a gente vê uma predador ambiental, uma pergunta minha, a gente poderia afirmar que o predador ambiental também é um predador social? E vice-versa, e a recíproca é verdadeira?
Yes, I think you're right. I've not heard this before, but that is very, very true. A person who destroys the environment is also an antisocial person. I remember when I worked with Marina Silva, And when we talk about sustainability, she always used the term socio-ambiental. It's always both, society and the environment, socio-ambiental. And so a person like this would be anti-social and anti-environmental.
Então é um padrão de comportamento. Então é um padrão de comportamento quando é predador social e é predador ambiental simultaneamente. Ou seja, não dá para dissociar uma coisa das outras. O predador, ele é predador de uma maneira sistêmica.
I think this is a very interesting idea. I have not heard this idea before, and I think we should develop this. You know? And what I mean, no, listen, what I mean is you should create. I don't mean you should write a dissertation about it.
Okay.
What I mean is you should help to create a legal framework so that there are laws that say when you destroy the environment, you are also antisocial and you will be punished for being antisocial. This would be a very important legal framework to connect the two.
Que o raciocínio também é o seguinte: como o indivíduo ele reflete a cultura que ele pertence, a tribo que ele pertence, então a questão é que nós temos, na verdade, uma cultura predadora. E os indivíduos são predadores porque a cultura, esse é um padrão de comportamento. Então a gente tem que atuar a um nível mais profundo, que é cultural. Seria algo assim, Capra, faz sentido?
Well, I think this is to act in a cultural way. This is what we're doing right here. This is what you are doing with this conference. So that's what we do. We act in education to change the culture.
Analisando a transmissão do conceito de ecodesenvolvimento proposto por Sachs para o desenvolvimento sustentável da Rio 92, este conceito de ecodesenvolvimento proposto por Sachs não seria apenas uma forma de mascarar o capitalismo? Qual o papel da gratuidade nesta nova rede de relacionamentos? Qual foi o melhor insight que você teve quando estudou a vida de Leonardo da Vinci?
Well, the first question would require a very long answer, and I don't think we have the time tonight. Eco-development and the role of corporations and what is often known today as greenwashing, of just pretending to be green, but really, wanting to make more profit. So this is a whole subject that is very important, but we don't have time for that tonight. The second question was really interesting to me. What is the role of free, how would you say, gifts in a network of relationships? And I think this is very important, because a network of human relationships is a network of mutuality, and it's a network of mutual solidarity, of reciprocity, and those are all things you get for free by participating in the network. And I think one reason why communities are so important today, to nurture communities are so important today, is because capitalism wants to convince us that we will be happy only if we buy more goods. All you have to do is watch television and watch the commercials and to see, buy this and buy that, you will be more beautiful, you will be more powerful, more attractive, and you will be happier when you do this. The counter remedy to that is to form communities, because in communities you don't seek and get happiness by acquiring objects, but you find happiness in relationships. And relationships you cannot pay for. It's free because it's reciprocal and mutual. So also for that reason, the nurturing of community is very important. Now the third question was, what have I found most inspiring about Leonardo da Vinci? Those of you who don't know that, I spent the last 6 years studying the science of Leonardo da Vinci, and I published a book called The Science of Leonardo da Vinci, which also is published here in Portuguese in Brazil. It's a fascinating story, and really the most interesting part for me was that Leonardo was a systemic thinker hundreds of years before the emergence of systems thinking. When Leonardo studied a certain phenomenon, he would always relate it to other phenomena and make connections. For example, he would study the flows of water on the earth that nourish the plants, and he would compare this to the flow of sap in a tree that nourishes the leaves and the body of the tree. And he would compare it also to the flows of blood in the human body that nourishes the cells. And so he always made this comparison between the same patterns and the same living systems, in different areas. And at the fundamental core of his science lies his quest for understanding the nature of life. This is what his science is all about. And it's very interesting that Leonardo lived 100 years before Galileo Galilei, who is generally considered the father of modern science. And Leonardo invented the same scientific method, the same empirical method that Galileo would practice 100 years later. But Leonardo's science was very different. It was not a mechanistic science, but an organic science, a science of life. That to me was the most inspiring discovery.
Fazendo uma pergunta ainda sobre Leonardo, houve uma exposição, eu vi uma exposição, falando ainda sobre Leonardo, eu vi uma exposição de desenhos do Leonardo em Boston, que tratava da visão dele de desastres no futuro. Não sei se você viu essa. Você poderia comentar qual é a tua leitura desses insights, essas visões do Leonardo?
Yes, these are very famous drawings of the biblical deluge, and they're called the deluge drawings. And he made about a dozen of these drawings in dark chalk, and they show catastrophes of hurricanes and floods and inundations, and the forces of nature are tremendous, and the human beings and houses are very small underneath. And he made this drawing. Well, there are many things I can say to that. I'll try to be short. First of all, Leonardo da Vinci was always interested in natural catastrophes. He had a fascination with power, with force, with catastrophe. He was a pacifist. He detested war and he wrote against war, but he also designed war machines, which is very paradoxical, because he was fascinated with power of destruction in nature and by humans. Now the other thing about these drawings is that he made them when he lived in Rome, and he was over 60 years old, and he was a little bit eclipsed in Rome by the young artists, Michelangelo, Raffaello, and artists who were hired by the Pope to make great paintings and Leonardo did not get a commission to paint in Rome. So he was very depressed about this. So these drawings are very dark and depressed, and that mirrors his emotional state at that time of his life. But what I found particularly fascinating from the science point of view, that these drawings contain many different turbulences, whirlpools, vortices, turbulences of water, a mixture of water and air. And Leonardo had studied these turbulences his whole life. And so these drawings are sort of like a summary of his studies of what we now call fluid dynamics. And they can be seen almost as a catalogue of turbulent flows of fluids. So from a scientific point of view, they're extremely interesting.
Thank you. Professor Capra, como o sistema de educação atual pode acompanhar as mudanças climáticas que estão hoje acontecendo? Na sua visão, quais as principais e radicais mudanças que devem ser adotadas nos atuais modelos de educação com vistas à utilização das redes sociais como ferramentas na construção de um novo modelo civilizatório? Quando vai começar a ser inserida esta consciência ecológica nas escolas, onde os alunos vão ter como matéria a importância de pensamentos conectados com a natureza? São 3 perguntas focadas em educação, no desafio das mudanças na educação.
Well, all these 3 questions, for all 3, you can find very elaborate answers on the website of the Center for Ecological Literacy. Unfortunately, it is in English. It's not available in Portuguese. But if you can either read it in English or have it translated, you will find all the answers there. We have introduced ecological thinking in the educational system, first in California, then in other schools in North America, and now we give seminars to educators and teachers, about 2 or 3 seminars a year, and we have educators coming from all over the world to California to learn about our pedagogy, including educators from Brazil. We had several Brazilians in our seminars. And the second question, the changes we introduce in education are radical because they involve this change of thinking from objects to relationships, from machines to networks. And what this means is that if you teach ecology as a transdisciplinary subject, you can do so only if the teachers in the school work together. So not only are we transforming the minds of the students, we are also transforming the structures of the schools. We turn them into learning communities that are interrelated. All this is described in our latest book, which is called Smart by Nature. Smart by Nature, and it gives case stories of many schools who have used this. So I have to refer you. Okay?